Imagine a world where the economy doesn't just crash, it vanishes. It is 1347. Europe is a ticking time bomb of overpopulation and poverty. The average peasant lives on the brink of starvation, working for pennies on land they will never own. But then, a silent traveler arrives at the port of Messina. It isn't an invading army, it's a fleet. Within 5 years, 25 to 50 million people are dead. Cities are silence. Fields are graveyards. To any sane observer, this was the end of civilization. But at History, Inc., we don't just see a tragedy. We see a massive, violent restructuring of the global market. The Black Death was the most brutal economic reset in human history. It broke the world only to build a wealthier, freer one from the ashes. To understand the reset, you have to understand the pre-game. In the early 14th century, Europe was suffering from a surplus of souls. There were too many people and too little land. This gave the ruling class the feudal lords absolute power. Labor was so cheap it was practically disposable. If a peasant died of exhaustion, 10 more were begging for his shovel. This created a stagnant economy. Why innovate? Why build a machine when you can just hire 100 desperate humans for a crust of bread? This was a world of maximum rent and minimum wage. The elite were hoarding the wealth of nations, while the middle class barely existed. It was a perfect, fragile pyramid scheme, and the plague was about to kick the base out from under it. When the Yersinia pestis bacteria finally hit the main arteries of Europe, the supply chains of the Middle Ages didn't just bend, they shattered. The Silk Road, once a highway of luxury and spice, became a conveyor belt for death. Markets in Florence, Bruges, and Paris closed as the merchants who ran them were tossed into lime pits. But the real economic earthquake wasn't the stop in trade, it was the collapse of the very definition of value. Suddenly, there was a terrifying paradox. Gold was everywhere. As families died out, their hoarded coins flowed back into the streets. Silver was plentiful, but there was no one left to bake the bread. There was no one to harvest the wheat or grind the grain. Wealthy lords sat in their cold stone manors, surrounded by piles of silver plate and silk, literally starving, because their entire staff from the cook to the stable boy was dead. For the first time in history, the CEO class realized a brutal truth: their gold was worth zero without the essential worker. The leverage of the world was shifting. It was moving away from those who simply owned the land, toward the few survivors who actually had the strength to work it. The scarcity of people had made human life expensive for the first time in 1,000 years. By 1350, the cold, hard math of Europe had been flipped on its head. The labor supply had been cut in half, but the amount of physical gold and arable land remained exactly the same. This created the greatest labor vacuum in history. In England and France, surviving laborers did something that had been considered a mortal sin and a legal crime for centuries. They quit. They realized that for the first time, they were the ones in control. They left the lands where their ancestors had been tied for generations and simply walked to the next manor. Their question was simple: who will pay me the most? Wages didn't just rise, they entered a state of hyperinflation. In some regions, the daily pay for a reaper or a blacksmith tripled in a single season. The elite were in a state of absolute, blind panic. In 1351, the English Parliament tried to fight back with the Statute of Labourers, a desperate piece of legislation. It made it a crime to pay or receive more than pre-plague wages. It was the medieval version of a government wage price freeze. But you cannot legislate against the primal laws of supply and demand. The lords were forced to break their own laws. To keep their crops from rotting, they started offering under-the-table bonuses, better food, free wine, better housing, and most importantly, legal freedom. The heavy iron chains of serfdom were rusting away, being replaced by the fluid power of the paycheck. The worker was no longer property, he was a contractor. This wasn't just a temporary bump in pay, it was a total, tectonic transfer of wealth. With these new, massive wages, the survivors didn't just buy more bread, they wanted luxury. They wanted fine wool, iron tools, tiles for their roofs, and meat on their tables. This demand birthed the first true consumer market. Small-scale industries, textiles, brewing, glassmaking, and smithing began to explode in the cities. The business model of the feudal lord was forced to evolve or die. They could no longer afford to manage thousands of peasants. They were forced to become landlords, renting out their land for cash. But there was a more profound side effect: innovation born from a lack of hands. Because there were no longer enough people to do the grunt work, the survivors had to find ways to make their labor more efficient. We see a sudden surge in labor-saving technologies that had been ignored for years: heavier, more complex plows, more efficient water and wine mills to replace human muscle. And eventually, the ultimate disruptor of the 15th century, the printing press. Why pay 50 monks to labor for years over one book when a single machine could produce 1,000? The Black Death had made humans too expensive to waste on menial tasks. It forced the Western world to automate. The Black Death is a grim proof of one fundamental economic truth: crisis is the greatest catalyst for human evolution. It took a nightmare to break a system that had been frozen for 1,000 years. Today, as we face our own disruptions, from the rise of AI and automation to shifting global labor markets, we have to look back at the silence of 1347 and ask ourselves, are we the Lord trying to freeze the past with useless laws? Or are we the survivor building the future in the ruins? History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. And at History, Inc., we'll be here to perform the post-mortem on whatever comes next. Don't forget to subscribe to the Ledger and like the report.